The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I stand in the House today to discuss the corrupt, Liberal $400 million green slush fund. And as I stand here, the former Liberal minister, Navdeep Bains, is literally across the street before the Public Accounts Committee. And he is continuing what has been a long-standing pattern of ducking, dodging, and diving to avoid any accountability and answer any questions about the Sustainable Development Technology Canada scandal, the $400 million Liberal Green Slush Fund. He is avoiding any questions from my Conservative colleagues, and it's not hard to see why when you dig into the rot that has occurred at the SDTC. I'd like to recap, as I begin my comments today, some of the background here, because a lot of Canadians may not be aware of just how horrible the SDTC scandal really is. The SDTC started in 2001 and for years operated without any of this cloud of concern. But with this Liberal government in charge, it became a $400 million slush fund for Liberal elite insiders. The Auditor General conducted an investigation and found the SDTC gave $58 million to 10 ineligible projects that could not demonstrate environmental benefit or the development of green technology. Another $58 million to projects without ensuring contribution agreement terms were met, and a whopping, staggering, Madam Speaker, $334 million to over 186 projects in which board members held a conflict of interest. Now, as I stand here, the former Liberal minister who was supposed to be overseeing this and making sure the SDTC ran properly is across the street denying any knowledge or awareness of these 186 projects with conflicts of interest. The reason the public is able to know what all has gone on there is because of a whistleblower who came forward from the SDTC, a whistleblower who came forward to testify, and I would like to read a quote from the whistleblower's testimony. The current government is more interested in protecting themselves and protecting the situation being a public nightmare, and they would rather protect wrongdoers and financial mismanagement than have to deal with a situation like this. Well, certainly everything we've seen from this Liberal government since the whistleblower's testimony seems to be backing up the assertion that there is a cover-up in place. That's right. That this Liberal government will go to any extent possible to avoid having a real, transparent conversation about the corruption that occurred at the SDTC. Conservatives are asking for basic accountability and for documents to be released and turned over so that the relevant law enforcement authorities can make their own decision about what to do with all of the evidence. But currently, all of the evidence is being withheld because Liberals refuse to comply. Now, a question that I think is natural to ask is, what do my constituents think about this? Because Liberals have gone to great lengths to downplay this as if it's not a matter of broad public interest in our country. And I've had the chance, thankfully, to speak with residents of Durham about this scandal, and it's pretty clear why my constituents are upset. Because $400 million is a lot of taxpayer money to waste. It's a lot of taxpayer money to dish out to Liberal elite insiders in a corruption scandal when we have very, very serious problems in this country that would benefit from taxpayers keeping more of their money and not giving it to the Liberal Party so that they can then send it out the window. So let's put into perspective what $400 million means in real economic terms for the average Canadian. First off, if you do the math, $400 million works out to about $9,700 per person in this country. That is an enormous amount of money for the average Canadian. Make life getting through the rest of this year a lot easier. But they weren't able to keep that tax money for themselves. No. They were overtaxed so that Liberals could take their money and then give it out to their friends. It's no surprise why Canadians are frustrated and upset. What else could you do with $400 million? Well, we are in the middle of a housing crisis in this country. An entire generation of Canadians, me being a millennial, being one of them, as a renter myself, who dreams of owning a home one day. and is now looking at a housing market that looks increasingly unlikely for us to ever participate. There was a time in this country where that could be taken for granted, that you do everything you're asked to do, you finish school, you work hard, you get a job, you pay your taxes, and home ownership would be a realistic, attainable goal. Not the case. So what would $400 million mean in those terms? Well, in my community of Durham, $400 million could buy you over 440 homes. Again, putting into perspective the value of the taxpayer dollars that the Liberals took from the public and dished out to their elite insider friends. In a housing crisis that is completely inexcusable. And yet we have a generation of Canadians continue to have a government turn their backs on us at a time where home ownership is just a distant dream for many. What else could $400,000 do for the Canadian people? Well, if Canadians are able to keep that money, that is the equivalent, based on the average amount of groceries that a family of four buys, according to the Canadian Food Prices Report. $400 million is the equivalent of over 24,000 families buying groceries for a year. Again, we put this into perspective. We have 2 million Canadians lining up at food banks right now. We have people going to grocery stores increasingly feeling the strain of not being able to purchase the things they used to be able to afford just a couple of years ago. Every time I go to the grocery store, I notice people who have to put produce or meat into their cart and then second guess whether they should put it back on the shelf because they're not sure they can afford what they're used to feeding their families. And at a time like that, $400 million being wasted of taxpayer dollars is infuriating, because people are making real compromises on what they purchase from the grocery store every day. And that amount of money amounts to over 24,000 families' grocery bills for an entire year. What else could you do with $400 million? Well, many people in this country right now are struggling with a car ownership, because we have a Liberal government that is increasing a carbon tax that makes it harder to pay for fuel and make use of a vehicle to go to work, to go to school, to get around, take your kid to soccer practice or hockey practice or piano lessons or what have you. And the cost of car ownership has gone up under this government. With $400 million, what could you do with a car if you could keep that money yourself as taxpayers? Well, that is the equivalent of 24,000 Canadians being able to pay for gas, parking, insurance, and car maintenance for an entire year. That's what $400 million means to the taxpayer if Canadians were allowed to keep that money. But instead, it was taken from them. It was taken from them to be dished out to Liberal elite insiders as part of a $400 million green slush fund. Let's continue, shall we, Madam Speaker? What else could you do with $400 million? Well, one of the things I hear from moms and dads a lot in my community is that there are an increasing amount of kids who need more services and support. We have, Lord knows, in my province of Ontario, an epically failing Ministry of Education, which puts an increasing number of children in a position where the day-to-day supports offered by schools just aren't enough to help kids get over the adversity and challenges that they're facing. So I recently heard from a mom and dad who were concerned about not being able to afford speech therapy for their kids. Speech therapy for 1 hour a week for an entire year in the Greater Toronto area, $400 million would do that for over 48,000 children. Again, when you put this in terms of what this money means for the average taxpayer, taking this money away from people has real consequences. And when they hear what is being done with that money, it is no wonder that they are frustrated by the current government and the status quo in this country. Last one, and this is an important one. I say this as a cancer survivor, as someone who has great admiration and appreciation for healthcare workers in this country. And I say this because we have a government in the Liberals that constantly likes to point a finger as if they're the only people who care about healthcare in Canada. Okay, well, if they care so much about healthcare, where is their apology to the Canadian public for spending $400 million of taxpayer money on Liberal elite insiders, which would have been the equivalent of over 60,000 people being able to stay at a hospital? According to the Canadian Institute for Health Information, $400 million would cover over 60,000 hospital stays in the healthcare system we have right now. And so the question then remains, $400 million being wasted of taxpayer money is incredibly concerning for someone who looks at these numbers and says, we have all of these problems stacking up across Canada, and then we hear what is being done with our tax money, and of course, we're frustrated. This is just an inevitability. Now, this is just putting what is a real liberal scandal in clear economic terms. But, Madam Speaker, I would also like to, thank you. Madam Speaker, I'd also like to touch on why some of the residents of my community in Durham are also frustrated by what's happening with the SDTC scandal, because we are big believers in making real, genuine investments in technology. My constituents in Durham, many of them either work in or have family members who work in the Darlington nuclear facility. It is an incredible facility in Durham region that powers our local economy and generates a tremendous amount of energy for our community. We have seen tremendous technology investments at the Darlington nuclear facility, including medical isotopes, which are now used to help with cancer treatments. We also have the development of small modular nuclear reactors, which will make energy, low carbon emitting energy, more accessible to rural and remote communities. This technology is being exported across the world. These are incredible innovations, and they're happening in my backyard in Durham. So my constituents know that technology investments are actually very, very important. And the Liberal government claimed that that is what was happening with the SDTC. The Liberal government claimed that that $400 million is going to go to technology investments, like the kind of investments we know could happen with that money in Durham. But that's not what happened. In fact, we have an industry that employs 89,000 Canadians, adds $17 billion to our GDP each year, and none of that $400 million is used to support our technology developments. None of it was used to support the nuclear industry. In fact, that money was dished out to Liberal elite insiders who, as I recap, were engaged in over 186 conflicts of interest, $58 million to 10 ineligible projects that could not demonstrate environmental benefit or the development of green technology. Well, I can assure you that the Darlington nuclear facility could have used some of that money to continue the great work that's being done there. And I can assure you that the Darlington nuclear facility is developing green technology and does have very clear measurable environmental benefits. Yep. Again, we are people in Durham who understand that these technology investments matter, but that is not what we're getting from this Liberal government. Instead, we're getting a cover-up of a scheme that took that money away from projects that could have benefited from it and instead gave it to Liberal insiders. That's right. Now, I'd like to continue with also addressing some of the other concerns related to the police, because we have heard from Liberals ad nauseum over the last few weeks that they are somehow doing the will of the police by opposing a basic request for accountability. And on that, I'd like to say, I do believe, Madam Speaker, that this is part of a broader trend with this Liberal government of frankly not respecting or trusting police officers. We have seen just recently the police associations across Canada, including the Toronto Police Association and the Vancouver Police Association, come out and criticize the Prime Minister and his Liberal policies for increasing crime in our country. We have seen a 116% increase in handgun crime under the current government. And police associations have rung the alarm. They've said, listen to us, please. They're openly saying to the Liberal government, please listen to what us and our members have to say. They are on the ground. They are seeing the consequences of Liberal policies every day. And what are they being told? Well, we've seen the Prime Minister stand here in the House of Commons, and we've seen the Liberal member from Pickering stand here in the House of Commons and accuse those police associations of somehow mimicking talking points from gun lobbies. It is absurd, and it is disrespectful to law enforcement in this country. But it's more than just that. The Minister of Justice has before him right now on his desk a report that makes a series of recommendations about the criminal justice system. And one of those recommendations is cutting police budgets. Yes, It is a recommendation that would take away 25% of the grant dollars from public safety and the Attorney General and the Solicitor General that police organizations are currently able to apply for, and it would say they are no longer eligible for that money. Now, if the Liberal government was as supportive of the police as they claim to be, you would think that they would have just come out and said, oh, this recommendation is absurd. We trust the police. We think they do a good job. They're important institutions in our community. The Liberals would have said, we don't want to even entertain that recommendation. That's not what we heard from the Liberal Minister of Justice. In fact, what we got from the Liberal Minister of Justice is a celebration, Madam Speaker, of that report. He called it, and I quote, history-making and an important milestone. Now, this recommendation is absurd on face value. The more you look at it, the more you can't even believe that the Liberals would even celebrate these kind of policies. But we return back to what we're asking them to do is turn over documents to the police and trust them to make their own decision about what to do with it. That is what basic accountability means. That is all we're asking for. We're not directing the police on what to do. We trust their judgment to make a decision. And in fact, the Liberals do not share that trust in law enforcement. And this goes to a long track record of anti-police bias. It is no wonder when you have a government that has this view of law enforcement, an antagonistic relationship with police unions, a Minister of Justice who is celebrating policy recommendations that will lead to the cutting of police budgets. It's no wonder that they do not have the confidence. Just let the police decide. Turn over the documents and let them decide what they want to do with it. This is basic common sense. So I return, Madam Speaker, to what is happening across the street right now. What is happening across the street right now is that the former Liberal minister, Navdeep Bains, one of the people who are supposed to oversee the SDTC and prevent this stacking up of conflicts of interest and misallocation of funds, he is across the street right now continuing what we have been seeing for months and months, which is that this government does not want to answer questions, does not want to submit to any form of accountability, barely even wants to acknowledge that any wrongdoing was done. This has been a continuous pattern that we continue to see. It's literally happening right now across the street, of thinking that they can misuse that amount of money, $400 million of Canadian taxpayers, and not even have to answer questions of a potential investigation. They could vilify a whistleblower who dares to speak up about what is going on over there. A whistleblower who, again, pointed out and called it right that this government would not want to hold themselves accountable and would do everything they possibly could to downplay this and avoid answering any questions, because for them, the PR side of this is a bigger problem than the taxpayer accountability side. And this entire debate right now that we're having about the $400 million Liberal Green slush fund really does come back to taxpayer accountability. This government is not entitled to everyone's money. No matter how much they like to raise all the taxes, whether it's, and to oppose us on our attempts to lower taxes, they can play all those games all they want. But the reality is they are not entitled to people's money. They introduce policies, and those policies are based on some mechanism of trust with the taxpayer, that every time we pay taxes, that money is going to be used for a good purpose that benefits our communities and our families, that benefits our country. And what we're seeing in this is a betrayal of that trust. A betrayal of that trust at a time where we have very, very serious problems that deserve attention. Very, very serious problems that could be benefited by taxpayers having more of their own money in their pockets. But instead, we are seeing them be overtaxed, and then the spending that comes from that overtaxation actually be done in a way that is entirely reckless. And now when there's a chance to actually have some accountability in that process, for them to not only on this side of the street be trying to downplay the problem, holding Parliament up, refusing to release the documents, but also on that side of the street continue to not answer any questions that we have at committee. Thank you.
Bravo.